as we look, of course, at developments around the United States and the UN, General Council, and of course around the UN Security Council as well. And to talk to us about this, we do have with us our international news editor, Sophie Mokoena, as well as Hopewell Chin'ono, a veteran journalist and author there. But before we even get into this conversation of the UN Security Council, Sophie, I'm smiling because you and I have speculated this before, and it sounds like this meeting between Elon Musk possibly and the president may just happen.
Well, you'd recall when the president was campaigning before the elections, when he was at Wits University addressing stakeholders. And these were people, influential people in the SADC region, looking at the elections in South Africa and the importance of these elections for the region. And the president was talking about a smooth election will mean that more investments will come. And he touched on the issue of visas. As we can see now, they are pushing ahead, but also he touched on this investor that he spoke to, who is involved in electric cars. And then when I came back to the office, remember I said to you, my suspicion, the president is working on meeting the Pretoria boy.
And I remember at that time we were laughing, saying, is it going to happen? Is it not? And now here it is. So certainly quite a big one. But another big conversation, Sophie, before I bring in Hopewell into this conversation, there's also this push for 2 new permanent seats for African countries on the UN Security Council. We heard from the US as well saying that they are backing this particular move. Your take?
Well, clearly this is an important development. But as you know, that the issue here will be, will Africa agree in terms of who must occupy these seats? We've already seen the president of Rwanda in East Africa, Paul Kagame, saying that the 2 seats must rotate. But my question is, Paul Kagame, you were driving the reforms of the AU, and this was key to AU reforms, AU demanding these 2 seats and agreeing that 2 countries will occupy those permanent seats. Now, if you say they must rotate, already there's a rotation. And secondly, the issue here is America saying no veto power. If we don't get veto power as the continent, why even waste Africa's time? And therefore, it will be critical to see what Africa is going to do or how Africa is going to approach this matter.
And Hopewell, as I bring you into this conversation, your take on how the continent is likely to handle this, could it be a divisive one?
Well, it's likely to be divisive. Anything that involves 2 places to be shared amongst a nation or a family of 54 is going to be problematic. But from where I stand, things are quite clear. If you need 1 country or 2 countries to occupy those seats, I've always thought that if it's being done in the interests of Africa, you should have the African Union representing Africa. If it's being done in terms of progress, you look at the countries that can articulate African issues on behalf of all of us. We can't all occupy those 2 seats. So South Africa is a clear runaway favorite because 1, it has the rule of law. This is what everyone is yearning for. And 2, it has the biggest economy. All African countries would want their economies to be somewhere close to where South Africa is today. And the competition that you talk about is going to involve countries which are bigger, but are not necessarily as progressive as South Africa, countries like Nigeria. We know that Egypt is also interested in that seat. Nigeria's fight is on the basis of numbers. There are about 223 million Nigerians at the moment. And Nigeria's argument has always been that it's an older democracy. It's where I'm using democracy loosely here, and it has a lot more people than any other African country on the continent. So I think it's important for Africans to sit down and figure out what this is about, because we should not forget that the United Nations was created without Africa on the table. Africa, if it was on the table, it was on the menu, it was part of the food.
Yeah.
But now Africa wants to be part of the leadership of the world. And it's important for Africans to determine how this is going to be done. And is it in the interest of a specific group of countries, or it's in the interest of the whole continent?
Before I take it back to Sophie, right on that point, Hopewell, one would then argue that if you have Africa at the table, why not give it veto powers then?
Yes, veto power is important, but the reason why they won't give veto power is because the United Nations Security Council was created out of it's out of a ceasefire document. It's a group of countries that emerged victorious after a war which was won 79 years ago to this day. And they see no reason why they would want to give a country like a continent like Africa. One of the things I think that really makes things difficult for ourselves is the style of leadership that we've had. That's why from the onset, I mentioned South Africa. I'm not South African myself, but I'm looking at the reality of what needs to be done and what should be done. And when you look at the style of leadership that is across the continent, the repressive systems, right now in my own country in Zimbabwe, there are over 75 pro-democracy prisoners in jail. So you would ask yourselves, is that the kind of country that you would want to represent Africa, or you want something different? So when you're talking about something different, and we agree on the basis of the rule of law, on the basis of a country that represents or reflects the kind of lifestyle that we want as Africans, then we can fight for that veto power as a group. Yeah. But what usually happens is that the West and the East, they usually find a way of dividing Africa. And you know, a house that is divided won't stand for long.
Now, Sophie, when it comes then to this difficult conversation that needs to be had by the continent, how does the AU then approach this one?
Well, you need a strong chairperson of the commission. Faki is leaving now. And when you look at the candidates, Africa itself, it's a mess. Look at those candidates. I mean, the front runner, you ask yourself, are we serious as Africa? But it needs a cohesive, strong Africa. Secondly, we know that when you talk about the Security Council, it's about peace and security. Which country has played a very prominent role in terms of being involved in peacekeeping and peace mission on the continent, even now? That's another criteria that has to be looked at. Secondly, as Hopewell said, yes, after 1945, after the war, they came up with the United Nations doing away with the League of Nations after the First World War, the League of Nations failing to maintain world peace until the Second World War. But Africans were there. There were soldiers who left the shores of Africa to go and join the Allied forces. So the Allied forces, that's your powerful nations, they can't come and tell us as Africa now that we were not there. Yes, you excluded us, but the reality is men went abroad to join the fight. And therefore, I think the big developed countries must be honest. And that is why I'm saying, if you don't want to give Africa veto power, keep it.
And when it comes then, Hopewell, to even the conversation about the Security Council itself, there's a view by some who are saying that while its resolutions are legally binding, but they're often ignored by targeted countries. So how then does, Africa getting involved in this particular body, and also as things progress and continue to change over time, how does this begin to be changed?
I think it needs to change because the complexion of the world has changed since 1945. As Sophie mentioned, the United Nations was set up after the League of Nations. There was no single African country in the League of Nations. And then we had the United Nations and the Big Five. If you look at the representation of the Big Five, it's Europe and America and China. You've got Russia, you've got Britain, you've got France, you've got China, and you've got the United States of America. If Africa comes in, I agree with Sophie, it must have a veto power. But Africa must organize itself first for it to be taken seriously in regards to those issues. I would think that if it's one country that is going to represent Africa, it's a no-brainer that it should be South Africa. We can fight over other ideological issues, but the country that has stood the test of time in regards to democracy, in regards to rule of law, and even its own security and how it treats its own citizens, it's South Africa. I would feel more comfortable being in South Africa and being taken to court than I would feel in many countries across the continent. And as Sophie said, the seriousness of Africa is determined by how we treat ourselves and the people that lead the institutions that are supposed to look after our interests, like the African Union. The lead candidate for the chair of the African Union is an old man, almost 80 years old, Raila Odinga, who's being sent there as part of a settlement in Kenya to resolve their local issues. So those are the things that make it difficult for the rest of the world to take us seriously.
And Sophie, of course, you know, what Hopewell is saying is something that we've also seen as the other countries are saying that reflect the world in the 21st century and include more voices in the Security Council. Do you think, though, that an honest conversation, listening to both of you, has been had by the Security Council about where the world is right now and how it is changing?
In the past few years, as the SG of the UN has summed it well, there has been a fracture and countries are drifting apart. In the Security Council, it's even worse because there's a power struggle between powerful nations. And all the time they use this veto power to exercise their muscle. And until such time, these powerful nations understand that they are sending the whole entire globe to destruction, we will continue to have this problem. But I hope that leaders tomorrow, in their statements around the world, will really be very hard on these issues. And we are looking up to the African group that they will put a strong, strong case for Africa. I mean, no, South countries will support Africa's position. China wants Africa to be in the Security Council. And therefore, I think they will support. I think it's up to the type of leadership we have on the continent. There was a time where you had Obasanjo's and them, and they were able to fight for the continent. We did manage to get things right. We were represented sometimes in the multilateral fora. For example, South Africa being a member of the G20, it was by no accident that leadership at that time was able to punch above South Africa's weight. And that's exactly what must happen, that we must have a decisive leadership, a firm leadership. But as Hopewell has indicated, when you have a pensioner going to lead the continental body, when the population of this continent, majority is young people, what's going to happen? And you are settling scores. You are trying to resolve a standoff in a particular country. I think South Africa, not Africa in general, we have to be serious about this moment because this is our time. This is our moment. You had the president talking about the minerals. The next transformation in terms of industrialization depends on us because we have those minerals that can change the world. But if we can't even resolve important power issues, how are we going to negotiate with those who came, the previous industrialization, took our minerals and left us poor? We are continuing to be poor, so we have to find a way to be better Africans.
If discussions are at this level, then Hopewell, what message does it send to young people across the continent?
I think it's important for young people to realize that we should put our differences on the African continent. For instance, we've got dictators on the continent, tyrants like Emerson Mnangagwa. We should not use that to throw the baby away with the bucket and settle scores. We should accept that it's important for Africa to have a seat on the table. It's part of righting the wrongs of the past, which came with a cocktail of colonialism and slavery. So it's important for that to happen. But it's also important for young people to demand good leaders that are not going to embarrass Africa. If we transfer some of the leadership that we have on the continent to the United Nations and they start representing us, Africa would be made a joke of. There are some countries that would actually want Africa to come so that it can be exposed. We should not give into that. We should send the best of the best and understand that when we say this particular country is going to lead us, we are not saying that that country becomes the boss. We are simply saying it represents the interests and aspirations of Africans at a higher level.
All right, let me thank you both for your time, and let's see how these developments continue then to unfold. That was Sophie Mokoena, SABC News International Editor, and Hopewell Chin'ono, author and veteran journalist.